Ciao amici, and welcome back to Experience Italy with Friends. Today's episode is about a topic that may not sound quite as exciting as wandering through Rome or sipping wine in Tuscany, but it's one that comes up constantly in my conversations with clients. Travel insurance. Do you really need it? Is the coverage from your credit card enough? What about the insurance the airline offers when you book? And if you're healthy and don't travel with medical issues, is it worth the cost? And honestly, for a long time, even I wasn't completely convinced. But after years of travel, and now years of helping clients plan trips, I've seen enough real-world situations to think about it very differently. So today, we want to have a practical, honest conversation about travel insurance, what it actually covers, what people often misunderstand, and how to think about risk realistically when planning a trip abroad. Let's get started. Andiamo! Experience Italy with Friends is a travel and lifestyle podcast where we will explore our favorite destinations and hidden gems, share key travel tips and cultural insights, and provide real-time updates about our move to this remarkable country. Join me, Tanya Razzo, an Italian travel expert and founder of Amici Vacations, and my Italian husband and producer, Davide Razzo, on a journey that is sure to inspire you and prepare you to create immersive and authentic experiences of your own in the beautiful country of Italy. Ciao, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Tanya, and as always, I'm here with my husband and co-host, Davide.
Ciao, amici. Again here with a broadcast voice because I do have a cold.
Sorry to hear about that, Davide. Stay over on that side of the room.
Okay.
So today's episode is definitely a little more practical than some of our recent ones. I mean, we're talking about travel insurance. And I know, this may not sound quite as romantic as Florence or the Amalfi Coast, but it's truly one of the topics that comes up most often in conversations with clients.
Yep, people ask about it all the time, Tanya.
Constantly. I mean, clients, friends, family. We've had many a dinner conversation about this.
Yeah.
And I realized recently that I've developed some pretty strong opinions on this topic. Mostly because I've now seen enough real-world situations over these past few years that have changed how I think about it.
And I think people are often unsure because insurance can feel confusing.
Yep. And, I think a lot of people genuinely don't know what they actually need or what coverage they may already have through credit cards or other insurance policies. And then you start looking at travel policies. I mean, the airline offers some, medical coverage covers some things, cancellation coverage. And it can all get overwhelming pretty quickly. And, I do want to say up front, I'm not an insurance professional, and this episode isn't meant to be legal or policy advice. This is really just me sharing practical guidance and perspective based on my own travel experiences and, the situations I've seen clients and friends go through and the questions I get asked all the time as a travel advisor. Because, I really care about helping people make informed decisions. And I hate just deflecting and saying, well, go research it yourself. There's ChatGPT.
Yeah, you like to understand things before you recommend them, right, Tanya?
Well, naturally. And, so today we just want to have a very honest and balanced conversation about, what travel insurance actually does. What does it cover? What people often misunderstand about it, and how to think realistically about protecting what is going to be a very important trip. But, before we jump into all of that, we always start with a quick update from life here in Montepulciano.
Well, what's happening in Montepulciano?
Well, I would say we're still recovering a bit from our recent move, right? And I'm so tired of living in chaos at this point. I mean, we have boxes everywhere. I don't know where anything is. I'm always asking, where did I put or where is? And my office is currently set up in the living room. But at the same time, I already love living in Centro.
Yeah, I do too, Tanya. I do too. I mean, especially when in the morning, I do my visit to the apartment to see how our restructuring is going, and just walking down and then up again, it's really nice. And you run into people sometimes and you just greet them, and We got to know some shop owners, restaurant owners. Even the other night, Tanya, I thought that was really lovely. We went to a restaurant up in Centro Storico, and you know, we had dinner, and it got like 11:30, and I go like, I asked the owner, when are you closing? I mean, do we need to leave? He said, no, no worries. He said, no worries. So he leaves shortly, and then he comes back, brings his guitar and started jamming blues. And I mean, it was really lovely. And that's really, you know, uh, reminding us why we chose this lifestyle, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those perfect evenings. Like at one point, I just kind of sat back because, I'm following a lot of the Italian conversation, but not fully. But I kind of just sat back and watched and took it all in. Like we were in the corner of this cozy restaurant and hanging out with the owner and the locals and just, I don't know. It was one of those moments that we've talked about where you're like, is this real? Like, are we really hanging out in Montepulciano with locals, just talking about what's going on around town and, local news? And it was really, really special. And Davide, what I think I'm seeing is that you're really enjoying this renovation project and, much more than I think you thought you were going to, because you're like, oh no, we have to do this renovation. It's going to be so challenging and difficult and exhausting in Italy. And every morning, I swear to God, you're like excited to leave and go hang with the guys and see what's going on.
I mean, yes, I have to admit, I really love it because I can see the progress that is being done in that apartment, and like from demolishing the old stuff, and now we finally are starting to put our new elected materials into this apartment, and I mean, yeah, I like to interact with the contractors to make sure that they have everything, so they continue the works. Even now we are leaving for 2 weeks to go to the States, and I've been preparing everything for Monday's meeting, so they have everything for the next 2 weeks. And, I just like to be involved in the details. So
I think so. You're loving it. And that's great. And, meanwhile, while you're busy with that, I mean, the busy travel season has absolutely arrived. And I mean, it's been steady all year already, right? But May feels like the big push, like all of a sudden everyone's coming and there are lots of client trips and, summer travelers are getting ready. And it's felt like my own version of tax season, I guess, the summer Italy push. And, so naturally travel insurance questions have been coming up constantly lately. People are preparing for these bigger trips. Spending is quite significant. They're traveling with family members and aging parents. And, and that's part of what led to this episode idea. Because I realized this might actually be a more enjoyable way for people to get the information than reading about it through my guidance document. Not everyone loves to read. They'd rather listen.
I mean, podcasts are usually more fun than insurance documents.
Maybe slightly. So, with that, let's get into it.
So, Tanya, why do you think people struggle so much with this topic? Or maybe a better way to say it is, why are people often unsure if travel insurance is really necessary?
I think part of it is that it feels like paying for something you may not ever use, or at least hope not to use. And, for a long time, that's how I looked at it too. We haven't always been great about buying travel insurance ourselves, truth be told. And part of that was probably because we've traveled a lot without major issues. So it's easy to start thinking, we're healthy, we're careful, nothing is probably going to happen. My credit card probably covers enough anyway. And statistically, most trips do go smoothly. So I completely understand why people question whether it's really necessary.
And Tanya, I think that people sometimes they don't really know what they already have as a coverage. I mean, when did you read last time your terms and conditions of your credit card that explains to you what you covered for or not? I mean,
no, I think you're absolutely right. And, between credit cards, health insurance, airline offers, and travel insurance companies, it can get confusing really quickly. And insurance language itself is not super exciting to read. And it's quite complicated, especially the fine print. So, I think a lot of people just end up making assumptions and crossing their fingers and hoping for the best.
Yeah, and usually, nothing happens, but until something does,
Yeah, you're right. And that's really the thing I've started realizing more over the past few years, that travel insurance can feel unnecessary until suddenly it isn't.
Mm-hmm. I think when most people hear the term travel insurance, they probably think more about things like delayed flights or lost luggage. Nothing biggie.
You're right. I think that's true. And, those are probably the situations people most relate to because they feel more realistic and familiar. These are flight disruptions, lost luggage, missed connections, needing to cancel unexpectedly. And, those things happen all the time. And, people also often assume that somehow those situations are already covered through either airline policies or credit cards, and which sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And so there's already some confusion there. But I think the bigger issue is that most people don't naturally picture themselves having a serious medical issue abroad because it feels so unlikely. I mean, especially if they're healthy. And, honestly, I used to think that way too.
Well, so what started, changing your perspective, Tanya?
Well, it's been seeing real situations happen to people around me, clients, friends, other travelers, and, not necessarily reckless situations either. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing.
Okay.
A lot of these were healthy, experienced travelers who were simply enjoying their trip. For example, one situation, I'm sure you remember, that really stuck with me involved a couple that was traveling in Sardinia.
Oh, yeah.
The husband was an experienced motorcyclist in his 40s, and they were riding a Vespa together, not driving recklessly. They weren't even in a collision. They simply lost control on some cobblestones and loose gravel, and it turned into a major medical situation. I mean, I felt so bad for them. They were like 2 weeks in a hospital in Sardinia. They both had multiple broken bones and surgeries, and then they had to spend another week in Rome before they were stable enough to travel home. And at one point, the family was looking into medical transport back to the U.S., which, they were telling me it was going to cost something like $120,000.
Wow.
And, I think that was one of the moments where I stopped thinking about travel insurance as like this emotional thing and, really started thinking about it financially too. Like those are some big dollars we're talking about.
Yeah, because even if the chances are low, the exposure can become very large very quickly.
I mean, absolutely. And sometimes it's not even dramatic situations. I mean, I had one client simply step off a curb wrong in Rome and break her foot. Thankfully, the private ER visit itself was actually very affordable. I mean, I think it was around 50 euros, and she received good care pretty quickly. And so I want to also say that Italy absolutely will take care of you medically. I mean, this isn't about people being denied care, but it's still out of network for most Americans. And depending on the situation, the bigger issue often becomes, the disruption to the trip, that you might need to stay here longer than intended, that you'll have like some additional transportation changes and charges, or you need medical transportation back home. And that's where costs can escalate very quickly.
Yeah. And I know that some of your clients are very, older travelers that are, sometimes they're surprised to learn that Medicare generally, provides very limited coverage outside of the US. Like we did now, I assumed that the Italian healthcare would cover healthcare in the US. And I found out, no, it's not like that. So, you have to do some research, what you cover them or not.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, it's those details that, surprise a lot of people once they look into them. And especially because many retirees are some of the most active travelers I work with. And once people start traveling internationally more frequently or traveling with aging parents, the conversation around medical coverage starts to feel much more real. So, another client of mine was traveling with his mother, who is healthy and active in her 80s. Unfortunately, she fell on a staircase and suffered multiple fractures. And She received excellent care in Rome. I mean, that wasn't the issue, but she eventually needed medical transport back to the US. And because they did have insurance, luckily, the logistics and costs of that process were handled for them. And, I think as we get older or as we travel with aging parents, those are the kinds of situations people naturally start thinking about more.
There's also situations nobody could possibly predict, right? I mean, things happen, right? One of the most eye-opening situations for me involved is our friend. So at the time, he was only 34, young, healthy, military, absolutely not someone that you would think as of a high risk to get sick. But he, while traveling in Italy, suddenly became, critically ill with necrotizing pancreatitis. Did I say that right, Tanya?
Yes, I think what it basically means is his pancreas burst.
Yes. So he ended up spending over 40 days in a coma in Italy before eventually being medically transported back to the US.
Yeah, it was incredible. Like, I still can't believe this situation. And I'm so thankful they had insurance and that he was cared for and he survived, which is, I think, quite rare in these circumstances. But he was telling us like the policy itself only costed, a few $100s, but it ended up covering things like the medical flight back to the US. And that alone would have been well into hundreds of thousands of dollars on its own. I mean, he was still in a coma.
Yeah.
And so it was a very high risk flight.
Yeah.
Then he had, he was here over a month. I mean, his partner was here incurring costs and needing a place to stay. So there were a lot of expenses there. Then there was the coordination of his care and transport. They actually had to change hospitals at one point. So you just hear about a situation like this and you realize that travel insurance isn't just about reimbursement. I mean, it's about the support and logistics you need during a really difficult situation in a foreign country where you need help navigating. And, I need to say, like, obviously situations like this are very rare. And hopefully nobody listening ever experiences anything close to that. But after enough years of travel, I think you start realizing sometimes it's not about the probability. It's about understanding the level of risk you're comfortable carrying. And, I think that answer is very different for everyone. So you just kind of need to examine what you're willing to gamble.
Yeah. I mean, the last thing somebody wants to experience is to be away from home in a hospital, because the only thing you want at that time then is to go back home and get taken care back home. So
no, yeah. I am so thankful that our friend had coverage and that he is now alive to tell the story and warn the rest of us about the importance.
And as we learned about the couple in Sardinia, when they were in the hospital, they had a hard time to communicate with the doctors. No one spoke English there. And I think one nurse was speaking English broken. So, medical terms and all that, they couldn't communicate, nothing. So, no, yeah.
No, it's no fun. And again, it's rare, but it happens. It can happen. And I'm just sort of surprised in this kind of short period of time that I've been being a travel advisor that I have this many examples to share.
Okay. So speaking of being a travel advisor, should people just automatically buy a travel insurance policy every time they travel internationally then?
Well, not necessarily. Even after all of what we just talked about, I think one of the first things I usually recommend is that people first understand what coverage they may already have. And because a lot of people do have some level of protection already through, as we said, credit cards, health insurance, homeowner or umbrella policies, or other travel-related benefits. And sometimes the coverage is actually pretty decent. So before you spend money on another policy, I think it makes sense to first understand what you already have.
Yeah. I mean, what I did, when we were looking forward, we were covered with car rental insurance, not to get off topic here, but I called actually the credit card and, I asked what was covered and what wasn't. So, yeah, but I think that's exactly where people get confused. They don't understand what coverage they have.
I think exactly the point. And because a lot of people have some coverage, but not always the coverage they think they have. And And this is where you really have to slow down and read the details or make a phone call and ask because, for example, do you have primary or secondary coverage? Does it cover medical internationally? Does it cover evacuation? What are the claim limits? What activities are excluded? Sometimes, Vespa riding or adventure sports.
Yeah.
And, sometimes people assume they're fully protected because they booked the trip on a certain credit card, but then later realize the coverage is much narrower than they expected. So, I think the key takeaway here is that it's important for you to understand your real exposure. Because for some people, their existing coverage may be enough. And for others, they may realize there are some pretty significant gaps to close. And, even with our own kids, I think about this differently depending on the trip. Our son is really into rock climbing and adventure activities. And when he travels, I absolutely want him carrying travel insurance because the exposure is simply different.
Okay, let's move on, Tanya. So let's talk about the types of coverages that are available.
So, this first category is probably the one people think about the most. It's trip cancellation and trip interruption. And basically, if something happens before or during the trip that prevents you from traveling or forces you to go home early, and that could be an illness, a family emergency, or any other covered event. And, this becomes especially important when you have a lot of prepaid non-refundable expenses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then there's the more practical disruption side of things, including trip delays, missed connections, lost or delayed luggage. And these are the situations people probably encounter most often. And depending on the policy, this coverage may help reimburse the hotels, meals, replacement clothing, or transportation costs caused by the delays.
Okay, so what about the cancel for any reason coverage people sometimes hear about?
Well, that's usually an optional upgrade people can add on to certain policies. And basically, as the name suggests, it gives you broader flexibility to cancel for reasons that might not otherwise qualify under a standard policy. So, for example, concerns about elderly parents. I have a lot of clients caring for their parents or worried about their health and if there's going to be any issues before the trip. Some people are concerned about, their work situation changing. I mean, the economy is constantly in flux. So they're concerned about job security or simply feeling uncertain about a big trip and being able to go on it. So it's a big deal and you may need to cancel. So it's important to understand, though, that these types of policies, again, cancel for any reason, often cost a bit more. They have stricter timing requirements about how early in advance you need to purchase. And it usually only reimburses a percentage of the trip cost. So, long story short, it's definitely something people should research carefully if they're interested in it.
Okay. How about medical emergency coverage? We talked a little bit about some of the examples that you experienced.
Yes, and this is where people often realize their regular insurance may not work internationally the way they assumed. So this type of coverage can include the medical treatment, hospital stays, emergency care, and sometimes emergency dental. Dental emergencies happen too on vacation. And then related to all of that, as we've talked about, there's medical evacuation, which is the part I think many people underestimate the most. And as we said, the actual treatment in Italy may not always be outrageously expensive. Actually, it's quite affordable compared to what others might be used to.
There's good doctors here too. So,
yeah. But coordinating transportation home during a serious medical situation can become incredibly expensive very quickly. I mean, we gave a couple of big examples, and that's something most people could never realistically pay out of pocket. I mean, again, it was $100,000, up to $300,000. I mean,
yeah,
we're talking big outlays.
Wow. Well, so really different policies may focus more heavily on different kinds of risk, right?
You've got it. And that's why I think it's important not to just click the cheapest option without understanding what's actually included because, two policies can look very similar at first glance, but the coverage can be very different once you start digging into the details.
And that's where I think people are getting confused because some of the things may already be covered through the airlines or the credit cards, but some they may not.
No, exactly. And I just want to point out that, every policy is different. And I just want to say, that airline add-on protection usually just focuses more on delays, cancellations, or baggage issues. And, some of the premium travel credit cards may include certain travel protection as well. Many of the coverages we just talked about, but where people often discover the gaps is with the medical coverage, the evacuation, or the actual coverage limit. And I think that's why it's so important not to just assume you're fully covered without understanding what's actually included. And it's one of the biggest misconceptions people have about travel insurance in general.
Okay, Tanya, thanks for talking about all these types of coverages for this travel insurance. But when should people buy it? When is the right time to do it?
Absolutely. Travel insurance can be purchased at almost any point while you're planning your trip. Coverage will still protect the prepaid, non-refundable expenses and provide medical and emergency benefits during travel. However, as we've noted, policies purchased later may exclude pre-existing medical conditions and may not offer the cancel for any reason or other time-sensitive benefits. And I want to add that you can actually buy policies right up until shortly before your trip, like 24 hours before departure. These plans typically focus on medical coverage, evacuation, and travel delays rather than trip cancellation. So this option may still be valuable for travelers primarily concerned about medical emergencies while traveling. But overall, I think you should be thinking about insurance early enough in the planning process so that you can compare options, understand the coverage, and decide what level of protection feels right for your trip.
Okay, but if someone waits a little bit longer than that, can they still get the insurance? And is it actually worth it to get it?
Absolutely. Even if you miss some of those early windows, people can still purchase policies that provide medical coverage, emergency coverage, evacuation coverage, and protection during the trip itself. So, I don't want people thinking, oh, I missed the perfect timing, so now there's no point. That's definitely not true. So, I don't want people thinking, oh, I missed the perfect timing, so now there's no point. That's definitely not true. But you should do this early enough so that you can still have time to, compare options, understand the coverage, and decide what level of protection feels right for your trip.
So how do you personally think about travel insurance now compared to, a few years ago?
To be honest, my perspective has changed quite a bit. And I think part of it is because of my background. I've talked about this before, but I spent many years in accounting and finance. So I naturally tend to think in terms of cost versus risk, return on investment, probability. And for a long time, I looked at travel insurance and thought, the chances of needing this are probably pretty low. And statistically, they probably still are. But after years of travel and now years of helping clients plan trips and seeing real world situations happen, I've started looking at it differently because while the probability may be low, the potential financial exposure can be enormous. And also I've realized that in many cases, the savings people get by choosing to book non-refundable hotels and tours instead of like flexible bookings, that difference can often offset much of the cost of the insurance itself. So now I tend to look at insurance less as an unnecessary add-on and more as part of protecting the overall investment in the trip.
Personally, I think what changed my perspective to travel insurance is actually, 30 years ago when we were a little younger, we, had no worries. Our health care was actually way better 30 years ago than what we have now. So over the years, health insurance has took away a lot of the coverage that basically now, it's kind of required to have additional insurance when you travel abroad. And like you said, it's an investment you make when you travel like that. It costs a lot of money and you just want to be protected.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Tanya, moving on. So if people are looking for a provider, how do they should go about that? I know that you did a lot of research, right?
You're right, Davide. You know me. I dove into the research and because, clients were asking me about this constantly and I wanted to feel comfortable giving people thoughtful guidance instead of just saying, go figure it out yourself. So I spent a lot of time, researched a list of providers, compared coverage, talking with clients and, hearing real experiences from travelers who actually had to use their policies as that's always, the proof is in the pudding. But interestingly, one of my clients with a shared background, she's a financial analyst, she did her own deep dive into the providers we were discussing, and she came back feeling very strongly that Travel Insured International was one of the better options. And, and then hearing firsthand what Travel Insured coordinated for our friend during his medical emergency in Italy, it really enforced that for me. So right now, Travel Insured International is the provider I personally feel most comfortable recommending based on both research and real-world experiences I've seen. And, that doesn't mean people shouldn't still do their own research and decide what's right for their situation. But for anyone looking for a place to start, I'll include my affiliate link in the show notes so you can learn more and explore coverage options. And if people choose to use the link, it also helps support the podcast, which we always appreciate.
Yes, so hopefully this episode helped make the topic feel a little less overwhelming, because I think a lot of people avoid thinking about travel insurance simply because it feels confusing. And with that, let's move on into this week's Tips from Tanya. Tips from Tanya.
So, we already covered this a little bit before, but I want to reiterate that it's important to first understand what coverage you may already have before automatically buying another policy. So check your credit cards, your health insurance, homeowner and umbrella policies, and any other travel protections you may already carry, because it probably is pretty good coverage, but just understand the limits, the exclusions, and especially whether medical or evacuation coverage is included internationally. So a little research up front can help you make a much smarter decision. My second tip is to critically think about the kinds of activities you'll be doing on the trip, because different trips carry different levels of exposure. Think about the Vespas, the types of hiking you'll be doing, adventure sports, rock climbing, even rental cars in unfamiliar places. And this is where it becomes really important to read the fine print and understand what activities may or may not be covered. And let me just say, please don't attempt risky things in a foreign country that you've never done confidently at home.
No,
This is not the time to be that adventurous, and vacation confidence can sometimes be very misleading.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I mean, when we went to Mexico, you wanted me to do some parasailing and stuff like that. And that's why I didn't want to, because, I didn't want to get stuck in Mexico.
No, and I guess my final tip then is probably the biggest overall takeaway from this episode. Understand your own personal comfort level with risk. I mean, it is such a personal decision. There's no one-size-fits-all answer out there. And some travelers are perfectly comfortable self-insuring certain risks. Others feel much more comfortable knowing they have broader protection in place. And neither approach is necessarily wrong. But I do think it's important to make that decision intentionally, not just based on assumptions or because you hope nothing will happen. Because while most trips go beautifully, unexpected things can happen. And travel insurance is really about deciding how much of that potential risk you personally want to carry yourself.
Beautifully said, Tanya. Thanks for your tips of this episode. Hopefully, talking about travel insurance made it a little bit less confusing and maybe a little less intimidating too.
Yes, and I know this episode was definitely a bit more practical and maybe a little more serious than some of our recent ones. I think my old corporate and finance side probably came out a little today.
A little?
But this is truly one of those topics that really does deserve a thoughtful conversation, because there can be a lot at stake financially when people travel internationally. And at the end of the day, I don't think this is really about fear.
No.
It's about understanding risk, making informed decisions, and helping protect both your trip and your peace of mind. And because the goal here is still the same: to relax, enjoy the experience, and fully enjoy your time in Italy.
And now after this episode, maybe next time we can go back to talking about wine, food, and all the beautiful villages.
Yes, please. And speaking of that, we're actually going to take a short break for a couple of weeks because we're heading back to the U.S. for a very special reason: our daughter's college graduation.
Yeah.
Go Hawkeyes. And I want to take a minute to say how proud I am of her. She's grown so much these last 4 years, and I know she's going to do great things. So I'm really excited to go home and celebrate.
Yeah, she actually called us while we were recording this episode. So said, you need to hang in there and we'll get back to you. Well, I can't wait to celebrate with her too. I'm a proud parent as well. And we'll be back in June, right, Tanya, with more Italy inspiration, travel planning ideas, and hopefully a little less insurance talk, right? But until then...
Right. Everyone, grazie mille for listening. And remember, life is short, travel matters, and Italy is always a good idea. Ciao, amici.
Ciao, ciao.
We hope you've enjoyed Experience Italy with Friends. If you like the podcast, remember to follow us and leave a review letting us know what you found to be the most helpful. And if you want expert advice or assistance in creating your own immersive and authentic experience in Italy, visit us at www.amicivacations.com.